The colony ship Argo died with a scream of tortured metal and a final shuddering sigh. It was not a casualty of war or a victim of some grand cosmic anomaly. It was the victim of a simple and brutally mundane navigational error, a miscalculation in its temporal drive that had shunted it 1,000 light-years off course and directly into the path of an uncharted asteroid field. The ship, which had been the last desperate ark of a dying Earth, a self-contained biosphere carrying the genetic legacy of 1 million terrestrial species and the last 10,000 human souls, was ripped open, its great spinning habitat rings torn asunder, its fusion core sputtering into a final silent death. The escape pods, a frantic, scattered handful of them, had rained down on the nearest and only habitable world. It was a planet that the ship's dying automated systems had designated, with a final black sense of humor, as Tartarus. From orbit it was a jewel, a world of vibrant emerald green continents, sapphire oceans, and swirling amethyst clouds. From the ground it was a beautiful and utterly alien hell. Captain Jax, his face a mask of grim determination etched with the fresh, raw grief of having lost his ship and 90% of his people, stood on a cliff of what looked like purple crystalline rock, overlooking a landscape of breathtaking hostility. The air, while breathable, was thick with the heavy, sweet scent of pollen and decay, a smell that was both intoxicating and deeply unsettling. The forest below was a riot of impossible colors, with trees that looked like they were made of spun, blue glass, and fungi that pulsed with a soft, internal, chartreuse light. The sounds were a constant, unnerving chorus of clicks, whistles, and deep, resonant chimes that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the survivors. They had landed with nothing. The escape pods were lifeboats, not cargo haulers. Their advanced food synthesizers, their hydroponic farms, their vast seed banks, all of it was a cloud of glittering debris in a high, indifferent orbit. They had a few weeks of emergency nutrient paste, a handful of medical kits, and the clothes on their backs. 10,000 souls had left Earth. Less than 1,000 had made it to the surface of Tartarus. And as Jax looked out at the beautiful, terrible, and utterly alien world that was now their prison, he knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that even those few were living on borrowed time. Dr. Elara Vance, the Argo's chief xenobotanist and a woman who had dedicated her life to the theoretical study of alien life, was in a state of what could only be described as terrified ecstasy. Her tricorder, one of the few pieces of advanced scientific equipment to have survived, was screaming at her with a constant, high-pitched wail of pure biological alarm. Every plant, every insect, every microbe her sensors touched was a masterpiece of alien biology, and every single one of them was, according to her initial readings, spectacularly and creatively, lethal. "The protein structures are chiral, Jax," she said, her voice a hushed, awestruck whisper as she knelt by a flower that looked like it was made of polished chrome. "Everything here is a mirror image of our own biology. Our bodies won't just fail to recognize it as food. They will treat it as a foreign, invasive, and profoundly hostile substance. The alkaloids in the pollen alone are a neurotoxin 100 times more potent than anything I've ever seen. This isn't a world that's passively dangerous, it feels actively and aggressively poisonous." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of scientific wonder and raw human fear. "We can't eat the plants. We can't drink the water without triple filtering it. We are living in the biological equivalent of a chemical weapons factory. We are going to starve to death in the middle of the most vibrant and beautiful garden in the universe." The first death came, as they always do, not from a grand, dramatic confrontation, but from a small and tragically human moment of desperation. For 3 weeks, the survivors had subsisted on the nutrient paste, a grim, gray, and nutritionally perfect substance that tasted of despair. The rations were dwindling, and the hunger, a deep, gnawing, and constant ache, was beginning to fray the edges of their discipline. A young man, a junior engineer named Leo who had lost his family in the crash, had been watching a particular fruit for days. It grew on a low-hanging vine, a perfect teardrop-shaped orb of a deep, inviting blue that shimmered in the alien sunlight. It looked like a blueberry, if blueberries were the size of a man's fist and had been designed by a master jeweler. He had seen the small, six-legged, squirrel-like creatures of the forest eat them with no ill effects. His logic, eroded by hunger and grief, had made a simple and fatal calculation. He ate the fruit. The first bite, he later told the horrified medics, was an explosion of flavor, a taste so sublime, so sweet, and so complex, that it was like nothing he had ever experienced. For a moment it seemed as if they had found their salvation, and then the poison took hold. It was not a simple poison. It was a biological deconstructor. The alien proteins, the mirror image of their own, began to do what Elara had predicted. His body did not just fail to digest them. It treated them as a declaration of war. A cytokine storm of apocalyptic proportions erupted in his cells. His own immune system, in a frantic and suicidal attempt to destroy the foreign invaders, began to attack his own body. Elara and her medical team could only watch in horrified helplessness as the young man's body literally, and with a terrifying, agonizing speed, unmade itself. His skin, his muscles, his organs, they were all being broken down by his own hyperactivated biology. It was a death of pure systemic and unstoppable anaphylaxis. He died not from a poison, but from a biological argument that his body had, with a final and devastating fury, lost. The death of Leo cast a pall of absolute, final despair over the small, huddled community of survivors. They were not just stranded. They were caged, trapped on a world that was a beautiful and exquisitely designed death trap. They were surrounded by an infinite all-you-can-eat buffet that would kill them if they took a single bite. The nutrient paste, their last tenuous link to their own safe biology, was now down to less than a week's supply. The children were growing weak, their cries a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the slow, creeping doom that was now a mathematical certainty. Jax, his face a hard, unreadable mask, had begun the grim and necessary process of organizing a lottery. It was a choice of such profound and terrible monstrosity that he could not bring himself to give it a name. But he knew, and everyone knew, that when the food ran out, their only remaining source of digestible Terran-based protein would be each other. The survivors of the Argo had not just crashed on an alien world. They had crashed into the first and most terrible moral law of survival. Dr. Elara Vance did not sleep. She lived in a frantic, caffeine-fueled state of constant, desperate research. The data from Leo's death, as horrifying as it was her only lifeline. She had his final agonizing bio-readings, a complete second-by-second account of his body's war with itself. She also had a sample of the fruit that had killed him. In her makeshift laboratory, a corner of the shuttle's cockpit that she had filled with scavenged medical equipment, she worked, her mind a raging storm of grief, of guilt, and of a single tiny and utterly insane flicker of a hypothesis. The problem, as she saw it, was not the poison. The problem was the response. Leo's body had encountered a completely novel protein, and its reaction had been to press the big red self-destruct button of a full-scale immune cascade. It was an overreaction, a panic attack on a cellular level. But the human body, she knew, was not a single unified organism. It was an ecosystem, a teeming, chaotic, and wonderfully, beautifully dirty metropolis of 1 trillion different microbes. The human gut biome was the most diverse and adaptable biological system known to science, a product of 1 million years of eating dirt, of surviving plagues, of a constant and often brutal negotiation with the chaotic and often poisonous environment of Earth. Her hypothesis was a gamble on a scale that was almost mythological. The alien proteins were a lock. Leo's immune system had been the wrong key, a key that had shattered in the lock. But what if there was another key? 1 billion different, tiny, and incredibly adaptive keys, all floating in the dark, chaotic, and endlessly creative soup of the human gut. What if the solution was not to fight the poison, but to digest it? She presented her plan to Jax, her voice a low, trembling, and deeply, deeply serious whisper in the dead of the Tartaran night. "We can't beat the poison from the outside," she explained, her hands shaking as she pointed to a series of complex molecular diagrams on her data slate. "Our own biology is too rigid, too predictable. But our microbiome, it's a different story. It's a superorganism that learns, it adapts. If we could introduce a microscopic and a non-lethal dose of the alien protein directly into the gut, bypassing the initial, catastrophic immune response of the bloodstream, it is possible, just possible, that our gut flora could learn to break it down. Not in a day, not in a week. It would be a war, a long, brutal, and agonizing war fought on a microbial level, but it might, just might, be able to create the enzymes, the acids, the biological tools to turn this world's poison into our food." Jack stared at her, his face a mask of cold, hard disbelief. "You want to poison someone," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Slowly, on purpose, based on a 1 in a trillion theory. "I want to save us," Elara whispered back, her eyes shining with a terrible and brilliant light. "I need a volunteer, Jax. I need someone who is strong enough to survive a fever that will feel like they are being burned alive from the inside out. I need someone who is willing to become a living, breathing, and deeply, deeply agonized laboratory. I need someone who is willing to be the bridge between our world and this one. The volunteer was a man named Aris Thorne. He was not a soldier or a scientist. He was a farmer, a quiet, stoic man who had been in charge of the Argo's agricultural ring. He was a man who understood the slow, patient, and often brutal language of life and death. He had a wife and a young daughter in the survivors' camp. He was a man who had more to lose and therefore more to fight for than anyone. He sat before Elara in her makeshift lab, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees, and he listened to her insane, desperate plan. He looked at the sample she had prepared, a single, tiny, and almost translucent sliver of the blue, teardrop-shaped fruit, suspended in a sterile, nutrient-rich gel designed to carry it safely to his gut. And he nodded. The procedure was simple, and it was terrifying. Aris swallowed the small gel-coated pill. And then they waited. For the first few hours there was nothing. A tense and hopeful quiet settled over the medical bay. And then the fever began. It was not a normal fever. It was a biological inferno. Aris's body temperature soared to levels that should have been instantly fatal. His skin, which had been pale and cool, flushed a deep, angry red. He was seized by violent, uncontrollable tremors, his body a battlefield where two different and utterly incompatible forms of life were engaged in a war to the death. The medics, their faces grim, could do nothing but cool his body with damp cloths and pump him full of electrolytes. He was beyond the help of their simple Terran medicine. His survival was now in the hands of the trillion, silent and invisible passengers in his own gut. Elara did not leave his side. Her eyes were glued to the biomonitor, a device she had jury-rigged to give her a real-time analysis of his internal microbial ecosystem. What she saw was a massacre. The alien protein, once it had reached his gut, had begun to tear through his native biome like a wolf in a sheep pen. Entire species of familiar, friendly Earth bacteria were being annihilated. The screen was a sea of red, a constant cascading stream of alerts that screamed of a total systemic collapse. Jax stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. A silent, grim presence. "It's not working, Elara," he said, his voice a low, defeated rumble. "You're killing him." "No," she whispered, her eyes wide, her face illuminated by the red glow of the failing monitors. "Look." She pointed to a single, tiny, and almost imperceptible green line in the sea of red. It was a species of extremophile bacteria, a hardy and usually insignificant part of the human gut that was known for its ability to survive in the most hostile of environments. It was a species that, on Earth, had been found in the boiling, acidic waters of deep-sea volcanic vents. And it was not dying, it was fighting back. It was mutating, its genetic code rewriting itself at a furious, desperate pace. It was beginning to produce a new and completely novel type of enzyme. An enzyme that was beginning slowly, painfully, and with an incredible, beautiful, and stubborn inefficiency to break down the complex, alien protein of the Tartaran fruit. The fever that was racking Aris's body was not the poison killing him. It was the heat from the forge of a new creation. It was the scream of a billion, tiny and invisible anvils as the last best and most chaotic army of humanity began to hammer the poison of this new, terrible world into the very sword that might, just might, be their salvation. The first bite had been a death sentence. The second was a declaration of war. For 3 days, the medical bay was the heart of the known universe. The fever that consumed Aris Thorne was a storm, a living entity of heat and pain that seemed to have its own malevolent intelligence. The entire camp of survivors held its collective breath, their own gnawing hunger a quiet background hum to the roaring, singular agony of the man who was their only and most terrifying hope. On the 4th day, as the last of the nutrient paste was being rationed out in grim, thimble-sized portions, the storm broke. The fever did not recede. It shattered. Aris's body temperature, which had been holding at a level that should have liquefied his brain, plummeted. He was covered in a sheen of sweat so profuse it soaked through the cot, and his breathing, which had been a series of ragged, desperate gasps, settled into a deep and profoundly, unnervingly peaceful rhythm. His eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot, sunken, the eyes of a man who had journeyed to the very edge of death and had somehow, impossibly, found his way back. He was weak, his muscles trembling with a deep cellular exhaustion, but he was alive, and he was, for the first time in weeks, hungry. Elara Vance, who had not slept for a moment of his ordeal, felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Her biomonitor, which had been a screaming chorus of red alerts, was now a quiet, beautiful, and utterly miraculous field of green. The war in Aris's gut was not over, but a truce had been declared. The extremophile bacteria had not just survived. They had thrived. They had mutated, adapted, and had successfully created a stable, self-replicating enzyme capable of deconstructing the alien protein. His gut was now a changed landscape, a new ecosystem where the native and the alien were no longer at war, but had begun a strange and wonderful and deeply unsettling form of biological negotiation. The change in Aris was more than just physiological. As he slowly regained his strength, it became clear that the fever had rewired him. He described a new and deeply strange sense. He could feel the life around him in a way he never had before. He could feel the low, thrumming energy of the crystalline trees, the sharp, pungent life force of the glowing fungi, the sweet, cloying scent of the alien pollen, which had been a constant, low-level irritant to the other survivors, was now to him a complex and beautiful language, a broadcast of 1 billion different, and now comprehensible biological signals. His body had not just learned to tolerate the world of Tartarus, it had learned to speak its language. He was the first human to become a native, the first and only omnivore on a planet of poison. The reaction of the other survivors was a strange and volatile cocktail of emotions. They saw him as a savior, a miracle, the living proof that their extinction was not a certainty, but they also saw him as a monster. He was different now, his eyes holding a strange, distant, and deeply alien look of understanding. He would walk to the edge of the forest, the place they all feared as a wall of certain death, and he would simply stand, for hours on end, listening to a conversation they could not hear. He was their hope, and he was their first and most terrifying alien. The nutrient paste ran out on a gray, overcast morning. The silence in the camp was absolute, a heavy, despairing blanket that was broken only by the hungry cries of the children. Jax, his face a hard granite mask, unsealed the case that contained the grim and final lottery system he had prepared. The time had come to make the choice that would, in its own terrible way, be the final act of their humanity. And it was in that moment of absolute final despair that Aris Thorne, leaning heavily on a walking stick he had carved from a piece of blue, glass-like wood, walked to the center of the camp. "No," he said, his voice a hoarse and surprisingly strong rasp. "Not today." He turned and walked with a slow, deliberate, and unnervingly confident pace toward the forest's edge. He walked to the very vine from which Leo, the young engineer, had plucked the fruit that had killed him. The same, perfect, teardrop-shaped orbs of shimmering blue hung there, a beautiful and mocking promise of a salvation that was also a death sentence. Without hesitation, Aris reached up, plucked one of the fruits, and held it in his hand. The entire camp watched, a silent, captive audience to either a miracle or a suicide. He brought the fruit to his lips and he took a bite. The reaction was immediate and it was violent, but it was not the violent, self-destructive cascade that had killed Leo. Aris's body was seized by a powerful, convulsive tremor. His skin flushed not with the angry red of a fever, but with a deep, vibrant, and almost healthy-looking glow. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips, a sound that was not just of pain, but of a profound and overwhelming effort. His body was not attacking the fruit. It was working furiously to break it down, to consume it, to turn its terrible alien power into his own. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in great, shuddering gasps, but he did not die. After a long, terrible minute, the tremors subsided. He looked up, his eyes shining with a wild, triumphant light. A thin trickle of vibrant blue juice ran from the corner of his mouth. "It's not just food," he gasped, his voice filled with a sense of wonder that was so profound it bordered on madness. "It's information. It's a language. I can taste the sun it grew under. I can taste the soil. I can taste everything." He had not just eaten a piece of fruit. He had communed with it. The poison had become a sacrament. The experience was not just nourishing. It was revelatory. His body, his mind, his very soul had just taken its first true and terrifyingly beautiful step into a larger and far stranger world. He had proven that the cage had a key, but the price of that key was a transformation so profound, so absolute, that it was a death and a rebirth all of its own. Aris's successful, if terrifying, meal was not a solution. It was a new and even more terrible problem. He was the proof of concept, but he was only one man. He could, in theory, now feed himself, but he could not feed the 900 other starving souls in the camp. The path to survival was clear, but it was a path that every single person would have to walk on their own. They did not need a hero, they needed a plague of adaptation. Elara Vance, her hypothesis now a proven and terrifying fact, became the high priestess of this new and brutal religion. She refined the process, calibrating the dosage, creating a regimen of microbial warfare that was designed to give a human body the best possible chance of surviving the crucible of the fever. But it was not a cure. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of every survivor. She needed more volunteers. She needed an entire generation of pioneers who were willing to risk a horrible, agonizing death for the chance, the slim and deeply uncertain chance, of a new and stranger form of life. The call for volunteers was a quiet and deeply personal affair. There were no grand speeches, no rallying cries. There were only the desperate, hungry faces of the children and the cold, hard math of their own impending extinction. The first to step forward was Aris Thorne, Aris's wife. She walked into Elara's lab, her face a mask of fear and a fierce, unyielding love. And she looked at her husband, at the strange, new, and beautiful monster he had become, and she said, "I'm next." Her decision was a crack in the dam of despair. Others followed. A young soldier who had lost his entire squad, a grizzled old engineer who had seen enough of death and was willing to gamble on a new kind of life, a mother who could no longer bear to watch her own child starve. One by one they came, a slow, somber, and deeply courageous procession of souls who had chosen to walk into the fire, not for themselves, but for the ones they loved. A new and sacred and terrible place was established at the edge of the camp. A quarantine zone, a medical facility that was more a temple than a hospital. It was the crucible, the place where the next generation of humanity would either be forged or would be burned to ash. The first, small group of volunteers, with Aris Thorne at their head, took the small gel-coated pill, and they lay down on their cots and they waited for their own personal war to begin. The camp, once a place of shared human suffering, was now divided. On one side were the dying, and on the other, in the silent, humming, and fever-racked tents of the crucible, were the ones who were fighting to be reborn. The great and terrible truth that Elara Vance had not, in all her brilliant calculations, anticipated was the sheer chaotic diversity of the human gut. The microbiome was not a uniform, predictable system. It was a unique and deeply personal fingerprint of an individual's life, their history, their very soul. And so, the war that was fought in the gut of each volunteer was a different war. And the victory, when it came, was a different victory. Aris Thorne's fever was a slow, grinding, and deeply exhausting affair. Her biome, it turned out, was not as aggressive as her husband's. It did not meet the alien protein with a furious, head-on assault. It engaged in a slow, patient, and deeply, deeply stubborn siege. When her fever finally broke, she was not the same as Aris. She could not eat the blue teardrop fruit. The thought of it, the very scent of it, filled her with a deep, instinctual revulsion. But as she walked, weak and trembling, out of the crucible, she found herself drawn to the strange, crystalline blue trees. She reached out a hand, and with a strange and deeply, wonderfully compelling urge, she broke off one of the glass-like leaves, and she ate it. It tasted to her like home. The young soldier's adaptation was a fast, violent, and brutally efficient affair. His fever was a raging inferno that burned for a single, terrible day and then was gone. He emerged from his tent, not weak, but filled with a strange, vibrant, and deeply, deeply predatory energy. He could not eat the fruit. He could not eat the leaves. He looked into the forest at the small, six-legged, squirrel-like creatures that scurried through the undergrowth, and his mouth began to water. His biome had not just learned to tolerate the alien world, it had learned to hunt in it. It had developed the enzymes to break down the tough alien flesh of the native fauna, to turn the creatures of this world into his prey. One by one, the survivors of the first wave of the Crucible emerged, and each one was different. Each one was a new and unique key to a different lock in the great poisoned pantry of Tartarus. One could digest the glowing fungi, another could process the thick protein-rich sap of a particular thorny vine. A third, in a strange and deeply unsettling adaptation, had developed the ability to filter the nutrients directly from the soil itself. They were no longer just a group of survivors. They were becoming an ecosystem. They were a human forest, each one a different species, each one with a different and vital role to play. The fungi eaters would bring back their strange, glowing harvest and trade it with the leaf eaters. The hunters would share their kill with the soil eaters. They were no longer individuals, scrabbling for their own survival. They were becoming a single, complex, and deeply, wonderfully symbiotic organism. Elara Vance looked at the strange, beautiful and terrifying new society that was being born from the ashes of her own, and she understood. They were not just surviving on Tartarus, they were becoming Tartarus. They were weaving themselves into the very fabric of this beautiful and terrible world. Their dirty, chaotic, and endlessly wonderfully creative human biology was not just finding a new home. It was becoming a new and vital and profoundly beautifully alien part of the world's own great and terrible story. The decades that followed the first Crucible were the strangest and most beautiful years in human history. The small, desperate camp of survivors did not just rebuild, it evolved. The settlement, which they renamed Chrysalis, grew from a collection of salvaged escape pods into a living, breathing city that was a perfect and often terrifying fusion of human ingenuity and Tartaran biology. Buildings were not constructed. They were grown, their walls a lattice of the same blue crystalline wood as the native trees, their power systems a network of glowing, bioluminescent fungi that were tended by the fungi eaters. The society that emerged was not a hierarchy, but an ecosystem. The hunters, their bodies now lean, powerful, and built for speed, would bring their kills to the central market, trading alien meat for the strange, nutrient-rich tubers dug up by the soil eaters, or the sweet, glass-like leaves harvested by the foliovores. A new generation was born, the first true natives of Tartarus. They were children of the Crucible, their DNA a beautiful, chaotic tapestry of human and alien potential. They did not undergo the fever. They were born into the new reality. Their bodies adapted to their environment as they grew, their personal microbiomes instinctively specializing based on their diet and their surroundings. A child raised in the high canopy-level dwellings of the city might develop a lighter bone structure and an uncanny sense of balance. A child who spent their youth in the dark, fungal farms beneath the city would develop eyes that could see in the near-infrared spectrum. They were human, but they were also something more, a new and vibrant branch on the evolutionary tree. The first generation, the survivors of the Argo, were now the elders, the bridge between a dead past and a strange new future. Aris Thorne, his own body now a testament to the profound and ongoing conversation with the planet, was their spiritual and scientific leader. His senses had deepened, his connection to the world so profound that he could feel the shift in the seasons in his very bones, could taste an approaching storm on the wind. He was no longer just a man who could eat the fruit. He was a man who understood the story of the entire forest. Anya, his wife, the first of the foliovores, had become a master of the planet's flora, her knowledge of the crystalline forest so intimate that she could coax new and previously unknown plants to grow, each one a new and vital addition to their shared pantry. The last of the pure humans, those who had been too old, too young, or too afraid to enter the Crucible, were a dying and deeply revered generation. They were the keepers of the memory, the living libraries of a world that no longer existed. They were cared for, fed the strange new harvest of Tartarus which had been pre-digested and rendered safe for them by the specialized biomes of the new generation. They were loved, they were honored, but they were also relics, beautiful, fragile ghosts of a humanity that was, in every meaningful way, already extinct. Jax, the old captain, was their leader, a man of iron and grief who had chosen to remain unchanged, to be the last, stubborn anchor to their past. He governed the new, strange world with a wisdom that was born of a profound and heartbreaking sense of loss. He was the king of a kingdom he could no longer truly call his own. They had survived, but in doing so, they had become the very aliens their ancestors had once feared. They were the Omnivores of Tartarus, and they were, for the first time in a very long time, at peace. The peace was broken by a ghost from the sky. It was a ship, a sleek, beautiful, and painfully familiar vessel that cut through the amethyst clouds of Tartarus like a memory. It was a Federation starship, a Star Chaser-class long-range survey vessel, its hull a clean, sterile, and brilliant white that was an insult to the vibrant, chaotic, and beautifully dirty world below. It was the FSS Hope, and it had arrived 100 years too late. The ship's captain, a young, brilliant, and deeply ambitious woman named Eva Rostova, had built her career on the legend of the lost Argo. She had been the one to finally piece together the faint, century-old telemetry data to chart a course to the uncharted star that had claimed the great colony ship. She had come expecting to find a graveyard. She was prepared to plant a flag, to say a few solemn words to close a sad and heroic chapter in human history. She was not prepared to find a thriving and utterly terrifyingly alien city. The first contact was a disaster of good intentions. Captain Rostova, following the strict protocols of the Federation's biological contamination mandate, did not land. She sent drones. The drones, sterile, white, and humming with a barely restrained sense of scientific horror, descended on Chrysalis. They took air samples, soil samples, and to the profound and deeply personal offense of the inhabitants, they fired biopsy darts at the natives. The data that streamed back to the Hope was a biological nightmare. The reports that flashed across Rostova's screen painted a picture, not of survival, but of a catastrophic species-level infection. The colonists' DNA was a chaotic, unreadable mess, riddled with alien viral code and protein structures that had no right to exist in a human being. The air was thick with pollen that was a Class A neurotoxin. The very soil was a biohazard. Rostova, a woman of science and of law, saw not a miracle but a plague. The survivors of the Argo were not survivors. They were victims, the carriers of a contagion so profound and so alien that it threatened the very definition of what it meant to be human. Her first message to the surface was not a greeting. It was a quarantine order. A shimmering golden energy shield, a beautiful and utterly implacable cage descended from the Hope and enveloped the entire city of Chrysalis. Her voice, filled with a cold, clear, and deeply tragically misplaced compassion, echoed from the sky. "Survivors of the Argo," she broadcast, "do not be alarmed. You are safe. We have detected a severe and widespread biological contagion. We are here to help. We are preparing a medical team to begin the process of your decontamination and cure." She had come to save them. She had no idea that she was, in fact, declaring war on the only form of salvation they had ever known. The reaction on the ground was not one of relief, but of a slow, dawning, and deeply insulted rage. The golden shield, which from orbit was a beautiful protective dome, was, from the ground, the wall of a prison, a sterile, featureless barrier that cut them off from the world that was now their own. The children, the first generation of true Tartarans, pressed their hands against the shimmering energy, their faces a mask of confusion and a growing, instinctual fear. They were being cut off from their own extended body. Aris Thorne stood in the central plaza, his head tilted back, his strange, new senses analyzing the energy of the shield, the pure, sterile, and dead frequency of a technology that was utterly alien to the living, breathing world he now inhabited. He understood Rostova's fear. He understood her logic. He had, a lifetime ago, been a man who would have made the same terrible and well-intentioned mistake. He and Jax, the two old leaders of two different and now colliding worlds, met at the base of the city's central living spire. "She sees a disease," Jax said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of pure, unfiltered fury. "She wants to cure us. She wants to turn us back into that." He gestured with a hand that was thin and frail and beautifully, wonderfully, tragically human at his own unchanged body. "She doesn't understand," Aris said, his voice a quiet, resonant, and deeply sad chime. "She is a gardener trying to pull the weeds, and she doesn't realize that in this garden, the weeds and the flowers are the same thing. She is trying to save the forest by cutting down all the trees. The first attempt at a cure was a gentle and insidious one. The Hope began to broadcast a low-frequency sonic wave into the quarantine zone, a frequency that was calibrated to disrupt the alien protein structures in their bodies, to encourage their DNA to revert to a pure human baseline. For the elders, for the first generation who had known the fire of the crucible, the effect was a wave of profound and deeply, deeply unpleasant nausea. It was the feeling of a conversation being rudely interrupted, of a harmony being replaced by a dissonant, jarring noise. But for the children, for the natives, the effect was agonizing. Their bodies, which had grown in perfect symbiotic harmony with the world, were being told that they were wrong. They collapsed, their bodies seized by a new and terrifying kind of fever, a fever of rejection. It was the pain of a body at war, not with a poison but with itself. That was the moment the negotiation ended. Aris Thorne, the quiet, patient farmer, the man who had embraced a world of poison to save his family, felt a cold and utterly implacable rage, a fury that was not just his own, but the fury of the entire living, breathing world around him. He walked to the edge of the quarantine shield, a single, strange, and beautiful figure who was both a man and a forest, and he reached out a hand. He did not touch the shield. He did not try to break it. He simply, and with the full, focused, and now terrible power of his will, spoke to it. He spoke to it in the language of the planet. He spoke to it in the language of life, and he told the dead, sterile, and beautiful machine in no uncertain terms to go away. The shield did not just fail. It dissolved. The pure, ordered, and beautiful energy of the Federation's most advanced defensive technology was touched by a force it could not comprehend. The sheer, chaotic, and infinitely complex will of a living world. The Golden Dome did not shatter or explode, it simply unraveled, its coherent energy breaking apart into a harmless, glittering cloud of dust that was then gently and hungrily absorbed by the strange, crystalline trees at the city's edge. The world was eating the cage. On the bridge of the Hope, Captain Eva Rostova stared at her screens, her mind a perfect blank slate of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The shield had not been breached. It had, according to her sensors, been digested. She had just witnessed her most advanced piece of technology being eaten by a forest. What happened next was not a battle, but an education. Aris Thorne, and with him, the entire collective symbiotic consciousness of Chrysalis reached out. It was not a psychic attack. It was a gift, a terrible, beautiful, and overwhelming gift. They shared their experience. They poured the entire 100-year history of their survival, of their fall, of their agonizing and beautiful rebirth, directly into the minds of the crew of the Hope. Rostova and her crew felt the terror of the crash. They felt the gnawing animal hunger of the first desperate weeks. They felt the cold, hard despair of Leo's death. And then they felt the fire. They felt the agony and the terrifying, beautiful hope of the crucible. They felt the war in the gut, the scream of a billion microbes as they forged a new and wonderful and terrible kind of life. They felt the first sublime and terrifying taste of the blue fruit, the communion with a world that was not just a place but a being. They lived 100 years of human evolution in a single, breathtaking and soul-shattering moment. When it was over, the bridge of the Hope was silent. Captain Rostova was on her knees, her face streaked with tears she did not understand. She was not just a captain of a ship anymore. She was a witness. She was an acolyte. She had been shown a new and terrifying and beautiful gospel. The Hope did not leave Tartarus with a report of a lost colony or a biological contagion. It left with a new and sacred and deeply, deeply unsettling story. It was the story of humanity's future, a future that was not a single, straight, and sterile line of technological progress. It was a future that was a chaotic and beautiful and endlessly, wonderfully branching tree. The colonists of Chrysalis, the Omnivores of Tartarus, were left in peace. They were a new branch of that tree, a new definition of what it meant to be human. They were a people who had fallen from the stars and had, in their desperation, and in their infinite and beautiful and dirty human adaptability, put down roots. They had not just found a new home, they had become a part of a new and far greater and far stranger, and far more beautiful and far more terrible story. And they were, at long last and for the first time, truly and completely home.